It's a great pleasure for me to have a chance to talk to all of you at the start of this Pune Dialogue on national security. It's a great honor for a variety of reasons, not least that I'm a son of Maharashtra and that this is a welcome opportunity to be back electronically on my home turf. Always loved Pune, as we called it in the old days, and I still love it even though it is now Pune. Um, I thought what I would do is talk a little bit informally, if I might, just about the challenges that I see facing both the world and India. Because I believe we are in a very different and new age than we have been in the past, and it's one that really is characterized by a series of revolutions that have taken place in the global order. The first one is really a geopolitical revolution, and it's one that I have talked about in my last book, The Post-American World. And to put it very simply, after 400 years or 500 years of Western dominance, what we are seeing is the rise of the rest of the world. It is not simply about the rise of China. It is about much more than just the rise of China, and the economic reality that I describe in the book then has cultural, political, and geopolitical consequences. So let me give you an example rather than just talk in grand abstractions. Turkey, 25 years ago, 35 years ago, was a basket case economy run by dictators, constantly in need of Western and American assistance and bailouts, and gained those bailouts and gained that favor from the West because it was a reliable and staunch NATO ally. Today, the Turkish economy is about 4 times larger than it was 20 years ago. It's $1 trillion economy, which for a country Turkey's size is a very solid and large economy. It has developed a very impressive military, modernized it. It is politically stable and has a very powerful, charismatic leader. I'm not talking now about the quality of Turkey's democracy, but the stability and popularity of its leader and its system. So when you looked back 30 years ago and asked yourself, how would Turkey respond and react to any kind of crisis in the world? There was only one question you had need to ask. What did Washington want Turkey to do? And Turkey would do that. When Washington said jump, the only answer that the Turkish generals would give was how high. Today we're in a very different world, and you could see that marker, that shift take place with the Iraq War. The Bush administration really, in some ways tied to an old conception of Turkey, planned its entire war strategy on the assumption of two fronts, from Kuwait, one from Turkey, without really consulting with the Turks, assuming that, of course, Turkey would, as always, jump when asked. But, of course, they were facing a new Turkey, and the Turkish government under Erdogan refused to do it. In fact, Erdogan tried in his own way, but faced stiff opposition in parliament and did not regard this as a crucial enough issue that he was willing to in some way override or persuade parliament otherwise. So having lost the vote in parliament, the United States had to dramatically alter its Iraq strategy from a two-front campaign to a one-front campaign. And one could argue that a great deal of the problems that followed in Iraq came from that initial inability to stabilize the country with enough forces in the first few weeks. Take a look at Brazil. Brazil, again, 30 years ago, a unstable populist country ruled by dictators, by military juntas, rampant inflation, and always a very tense relationship with the United States, both dependence but still resentment. Today Brazil has a stable democratic government, was able to go through a process of impeachment, even which is an extraordinary test of a democracy, and it went through it successfully. And despite its economic troubles right now, in the sense that it is not doing as well as it was in the past, remember Turkey has 350 billion in foreign exchange reserves. It is growing solidly. It is recovering nicely. And in general, again, looking back over the longer term, Turkey is more stable, more successful than it has been at any time. And as a result, it's far more confident in its foreign policy and far more confident in its ability to stand up to, for example, the United States. Brazil has engaged in a kind of Asian diplomacy, and particularly a Chinese diplomacy of a kind that very few people would have predicted a few decades ago. And those stories can be repeated in country after country, because what you are seeing is the economic success of countries that have found a way to hook into the global economy, transform their own economies to make them more market and trade friendly, and then also find a way to achieve from that political stability and a certain kind of national confidence. And you see this in country after country, in region after region. Obviously, it is particularly striking in Asia because of the rise of China. But in general, this phenomenon of the rise of the rest is characterizing so many parts of the world. And as a result of it, the major players, most particularly the United States, has less power and influence than it did before. The first line in my book is, this is not a book about the rise of this is not a book about the decline of America, but rather the rise of everyone else. And I still believe that to be true. America continues to do very well economically, continues to do very well in terms of its military power and influence. I know that you are all thinking about one big subject, and that is the circus that is the Donald Trump presidency. And it is a circus. And I'm sure that we could have a whole conference on that subject alone. But for now, I'm trying to talk about the broader, deeper trends. And the broad, deep trend here is one that, in fact, encompasses Bush, Obama, and Trump, which is the rise of a post-American world, a world in which the United States is merely the single most powerful country. And what I mean by that is it's a world in which the United States is the most powerful country, but not the sole shaper and pivot of the international system. In the years after the Cold War ended, the United States really was the international system. The international system was characterized by an American order upheld, defined, shaped, and guaranteed by the United States. That world is passing. It's not entirely clear what the new world will look like, which is why I call it a post-American world. But it is a world that certainly is going to be shaped by a multiplicity of forces and actors rather than the power and preferences of just one single actor. The largest shift geopolitically, without any question, is the rise of China. In 1990, China was 2% of global GDP. Today, depending on how you count it, it's probably between 10 and 14% of global GDP. That is the single largest rise in percentage share of global GDP in recorded history. No country of any size, of reasonable size and scale, has ever grown so fast and gone so far. So the Chinese economic miracle has to be regarded as having a political corollary, a geopolitical corollary, which is that the rise of China is the single most dramatic shift in international geopolitics, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union. And in many ways, it may be a much more powerful shift because it is likely to be quite long-lasting. I think at this point, it's important for Indians particularly to recognize that this race is over, by which I mean for a while there were people who talked about India versus China. I always thought this was a case where Indians were believing the kind of their own rhetoric rather than looking at reality. China has been growing faster than India, substantially faster than India, for 2.5 decades now. China's economy is about 4 times the size of India's economy. It is still growing about as fast, maybe even faster than India's. It's difficult. I mean, for Indians are supposed to be good at math and mathematics. It's not; those lines are not going to meet unless something very dramatic happens on either end, which is a collapse of the Chinese economy or 12% growth in the Indian economy for a decade. I don't suspect either will happen. And so the reality is a China that is utterly dominant in Asia, the second largest economy in the world, probably comfortably on its way to becoming the largest economy in the world in purchasing power terms. Now, what does that mean? It has geopolitical consequences. China is already engaged actively in the South China Seas militarily in a way that it was not even 10 years ago. It is actively engaged diplomatically, in geoeconomically in Africa and Latin America in a way that it was not 10 years ago. And of course, it is both geoeconomically and geopolitically building a kind of network with its infrastructure projects, with its foreign aid, ones that naturally impact very directly on India. I think that that is the geopolitical landscape that we are looking at. And I'll come back to what India's response to it should be. But then there is a geoeconomic landscape that relates to this. We have gone through 25 years or so since the end of the Cold War, in which we have believed that free markets, free trade, globalization, and the information revolution are all unalloyed goods, unadulterated benefits to the international system. And what we are now experiencing is the age of backlash. That backlash is mostly happening in the Western world, of course. It is a backlash of Western workers who are realizing that these forces, while in general having positive benefits, are not distributed equally. And they are the principal, they are cost bearers of these forces. If you look at income rises over the last 2 or 3 decades, what is striking is the graph looks positive for almost every segment of the global economy, except for that piece of it that would characterize the Western middle class, working class to middle class. Western upper classes have done well. Even some of the poorest people in the Western world have seen their wages go up. But it is the vast middle in the West that has not benefited, and that is the backlash you are seeing in populist terms, both in the United States and in Western Europe. What I think you're also witnessing is a sense that free trade does not lift all boats, that it produces too much change too fast. And you are seeing that in the West with the desire for more activist trade policy. You're seeing it with the realization that a country like China may have gotten away with more than anyone believed it could. If you go to China, as I have tried to go every year for the last two decades, what is striking in the last few years is to see how China has been able to very effectively expel, formally or informally, almost every Western company and brand, with the exception of the luxury goods space. If you go anywhere else in the world, we are struck by the dominance of Google and Facebook and Amazon and Uber and Microsoft. If you go to China, it is a land without any of those companies. They have managed to create a Chinese ecosystem, which is very different from the Western one. And it is producing, I think, a certain amount of doubt or buyer's remorse among Western economists, experts, politicians, and of course the public as to whether or not China was led into the global system too far, too fast. Nothing can be done about that at this stage. Well, not a lot can be done about it. But certainly it means I think there will be a different attitude towards free trade, a different attitude towards global trade, and a different attitude towards issues such as outsourcing than they have been in the past. It even extends to the realm of technology. Information technology and the information revolution were regarded as unalloyed goods. The technology companies were the blue-eyed boys of the world. But now we're beginning to recognize that, in fact, this new digital economy is one in which there are enormous first-mover advantages, and a few companies have managed to create quasi-monopolies in this space. I was in Silicon Valley recently and was struck by the degree to which Small companies there no longer really even pretend to have a viable path to continued existence. Their business plan is to be bought by Google or Facebook. Their business plan is to be consolidated into one of the 4 or 5 vast conglomerates, and they are increasingly conglomerates, that dominate the digital economy. Well, that produces a very different political reaction to these companies than the kind of cool vision of these savvy tech entrepreneurs who are just like all of us, wearing blue jeans and t-shirts, just happen to be worth $20 billion. Now there is a sense that these companies are large, they are monopolies, they are politically savvy and influential, and that will produce a different public attitude towards them over time. So all of this means we are in a different kind of economic era and ideological era than we have been in the past. And I think that plays into the degree to which there will be a celebration of globalization, interconnectivity, migration flows. And you're seeing the backlash most strongly on the migration issue. There has been a lot of migration in the last 25 years. If you look at the foreign-born population in the United States in 1970, it was 4% of America, 4.5%, I think precisely. It is now 14% of America. So you have seen about 750 million people around the world move borders in the last 25 to 30 years. I wonder if that wave is over, whether we are going to see a very different wave with a very different attitude towards migration in the next few decades. I think people can handle the globalization of goods, of capital, of services, but the globalization of people is the kind of final frontier, and it is the one that has produced the most visceral reaction among people, partly because it's very real. It hits you in the face. It's people who are moving into your communities, who look different, sound different, seem different, worship different gods, speak different languages, have different customs. And that reaction to globalization is perhaps the most, it is the gut level response. And it has already changed. You can see it in the rise of populist parties all over the world. So that is the new geo-economic reality, and it produces, I think, a new cultural reality. So you go from geopolitics to geoeconomics to geoculture, if you will, and that cultural reality is manifested very simply in something that encompasses all of this, and that is the rise of nationalism. If you ask yourself what leaders are doing well around the world, I don't mean well by Western standards, 40%, 41% approval ratings are considered decent in the West, 45%, 50% certainly is glowing. I mean really strong approval ratings, 60, 65, 70% approval ratings. Who have those kind of approval ratings? Well, Modi, Putin, Xi, Erdogan, Abe. What do they all have in common? They are all good manipulators of nationalism. They know how to take that force and ally it to their purposes. And leaders who have found a way to speak the language of nationalism have succeeded in this last decade more than anyone could have predicted. And Western leaders who still talk the language of globalism, cosmopolitanism, liberal internationalism, are finding they face a lot of backlash. Now, what that means is that this force is going to be the primary dominant force going forward for every country to navigate. And what we are going to face in the geopolitical realm and the geoeconomic realm are activist nationalist governments that are going to pursue activist nationalist policies, from foreign policy to defense policy to trade policy. And I think that we are going to be living in a world that is, as a result, much more driven by these national encounters than by international consensus. What does this all mean for for India? Well, I think India's biggest problem is it has not thought seriously and strategically about the world for a long time. I think there was a serious strategic conversation that took place in India in the 1950s with Jawaharlal Nehru really defining India's foreign policy. Um, you can agree or disagree with it. In my own view, Nehru's vision was quite naive. It was overly ideological and not realpolitik enough. You could see that most distinctly in his view of China, um, and to a certain extent the United States. Uh, but be that as it may, there was a ideological kind of framework. The tragedy for India is since then there has really been no serious conversation. In many ways, the uh, foreign policy mandarins, the MEA has essentially been on autopilot, assuming that whatever Nehru wrote in the 1950s remains the kind of diktat by which to run things, with the few exceptions that took place under Vajpayee's government and such. And until we got very recently to a reorientation. And that reorientation has been very powerful, it has been very pragmatic, but it has not resulted in an ideological rethink or a strategic rethink of the world that we live in. So India accepted the nuclear deal, bizarrely, rather grudgingly, even though the concessions offered it were concessions that were, quite extraordinary. I mean, ones that the United States would never have made to any other country in any other circumstance. And yet, it was an uphill battle for the Manmohan Singh government to get it through. And I think that was because India has not thought through its role in this new world strategically. The fundamental reality India faces is the rise of China, and the rise of China on such a scale that it is vying to be the utterly dominant power in Asia. You see this with its infrastructure and aid initiatives that attempt to tie in all of Central Asia and thus separate Central Asia from the Russians and from the old Soviet Union. You see it in its policies that have attempted to essentially isolate the few countries that remain opposed to it in East Asia, like Vietnam and Japan. And you see it in the network that it is putting together to surround India, from Burma to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to Pakistan. A network of ports, of foreign aid, of assistance, of travel routes, and increasingly of military assistance and cooperation. This is the Chinese strategy. It's very careful, very very thought through, very well funded. If you look at the expansion of the Chinese Foreign Ministry over the last 20 years, it is an extraordinary expansion. If you look at the quality, I'm struck by the remarkable rise in the quality of Chinese diplomats. Their ability, for example, to speak English, to navigate through international organizations, extraordinarily successfully and smoothly. And then you compare that to India. India is still stuck in a kind of old mode with a small foreign service, poorly funded, with very weak conception of what exactly it is trying to do. Um, still believing in some sense that a good speech at the UN is what matters, and mostly inwardly, parochially oriented. Look at an Indian newspaper today. I travel all over the world, and I will tell you, probably without doubt, without question, Indian newspapers are the most parochial newspapers in the world. They have the least foreign news, they have the least coverage of foreign affairs. I don't mean the thin, tiny sliver of people at the top who may talk about it some. But it is extraordinary the degree to which India is insular. Perhaps it's because it is a vast subcontinental nation, enormous diversities. But for whatever reason, it is not working, because what is happening is Asia is being reshaped while India is watching as a spectator, passively, without actively taking part in this process. And I think that it is time for India to really have a much more forward-looking, serious, strategic conversation about what it means to live in this new world, in this new continent in Asia, and what it means to live with the rise of China. I think that it really means that the Indian government needs to have a much, much stronger diplomatic effort, much stronger and more strategic geopolitical effort, recognize that it is inevitably on the side of the United States in the balance of power in Asia, inevitably is going to find itself, if not in opposition, but in contradistinction to China, figure out what that means in region after region, but most importantly, put together a coherent alternative to the Chinese strategy. It doesn't mean that there has to be some kind of conflict uh, between China and India. It doesn't mean that there has to be a confrontation. Though I will point out, China has solved 16 of its 17 border disputes, land border disputes, in the last 20 years. The one border dispute it has not solved is the one with India, and that is, of course, because it is the one in which China's claims are ones that cannot be reconciled with India, and China does not want to make concessions on that front. So you face, a really powerful set of immediate tactical issues, larger strategic issues, and my great concern is that India is essentially asleep at the switch and remains asleep at the switch. So if I could send any message to you to this conference, this dialogue, is that India really needs to get its act together. First intellectually, then in terms of the resources it devotes, and finally in terms of the actions it takes on the world stage and on the Asian stage. The time for a parochial, isolated, somnolent India are over. I think India has to wake up, and I hope it will. Thank you all very much.